All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to Best Practices for Including Diversity and Inclusion in Medtech. My name is Nicole Owens and I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for Medtech. If you're not familiar with Medtech, we are a medical device trade association representing more than 300 companies throughout New England. And we work to bolster the ecosystem through educational events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Quick housekeeping note, there is going to be ample time today for Q&A. So we do encourage you throughout the conversation to leverage the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And our moderator for today will address those live as pertinent. This webinar is also being recorded, so everyone who registered for the webinar will receive a copy of this after the webinar. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Alira Health as our sponsor for this webinar today. We cannot present these types of educational opportunities without partnership from our members and sponsors, so thank you very much. And without further ado, I would love to turn it over to our moderator for today. Renee Willem is the Senior Director of Evidence and Outcomes at Alira Health. Renee.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We have an excellent panel lined up to discuss this critical topic today. As you may be aware, the FDA recently released their diversity plans to improve enrollment and participation from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials, a guidance for industry. And this reflects a growing awareness and recognition of the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion across all of our daily activities, but particularly within medtech and the healthcare ecosystem. So I'm delighted to now have our panelists introduce themselves to you before we get into our discussion. So I'd love to start with Neda Hanafi.
Thank you, Renee. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So I'm Neda Hanafi. I currently am the Senior Vice President at Verinex, which is a service entity focused on regulatory quality and clinical, and my space is within the regulatory strategy. My background, I also am a co-founder of Medtech Color, which is a nonprofit focused on increasing the representation of people of color within medtech and diversity and equity inclusion programming. And I'm also the on the executive planning committee for the Medtech Color Collaborative Community. And there our focus is on diversity and inclusion in product development within medtech and then also in clinical study research. So it's a pleasure to be with you and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neda. Neely Williams, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Thank you, Renee. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I love being a last minute hitter. So it's my goal to be with you be as present and as sharing as I possibly can be in this moment, and grateful that you thought of me. I am Neely Williams. I am the founder and administrator of Community Partners Link Network of Services here in Nashville, Tennessee. It is a collaborative of folks with expertise in helping the services in community, with a history of doing so. And so we like to say over at CPLN that we connect needs to resources. And that is a primary function for what we do through consultant activities and contracts. I am also the director of the state of Tennessee SEAL program. I'm the director of their education and engagement function. And so we have been embedded in the community there for the last 2 years. It's something that we're all impacted by, and that's COVID. And now we're doing a lot of work around long COVID. I also serve on the governance structure for the CoreNet, which is a network of funded organizations in PCORE that address large-scale research components. I serve on that steering committee, the executive management team, and I'm a busy little old lady, but I am so grateful to be able to be here and sit with you in this moment. And I'm looking forward to our continued engagement here and here past this point in other opportunities as they arise.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Neely. Jamie Wheeler.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. So my name is Jamie Wheeler. I'm the Senior Vice President of Clinical Affairs for Edwards Life Sciences. So we're a medical device company and I work in cardiology. Basically what I do is I oversee a pretty large team of several hundred researchers all around the globe. And my team is responsible for generating the safety and effectiveness data that actually allows us to put devices into people. My experience, I've done this now for, gosh, a little over 25 years. It's getting long. I've done it all over the world. So I actually lived in Japan for a number of years. I've worked in both medical devices and pharmaceutical clinical research. I was an EMT early on in my career, so I had a little bit of the patient side of things. And I actually have a lot of family and friends who are involved in clinical trials. So I get a lot of feedback on how to make things better. And that's why I'm here today. I work actually with Meta too, as well, in the Medtech Color Collaborative community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jamie. And last but not least, Kathleen Trager. And you're just still on mute there, Kathleen. It wouldn't be a COVID webinar without it happening at least once.
Good afternoon. So it's a pleasure to be here today discussing this really important topic with a phenomenal panel. Kathleen Trager, I'm the Senior Director of Device Diagnostic and Digital Health at Adion, health analytics company, where we use real-world evidence and data science to really power critical decisions in healthcare. In addition to my work at Adion, I'm active throughout the med device community with a number of med tech functions. And like Neely, I've been very involved with Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, where I am a member of the Board of Governors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just for some additional context, as Alira Health, a sponsor of this webinar, we work with a variety of groups across this continuum that is also represented by the panel, as well as providing technology that allows patients to partner directly in these initiatives to provide their real-time and real-world patient experience data. So as an anthropologist within the broader Alira Health team, this topic is very near and dear to my heart. And as you can see, we have an excellent panel that really represents a diversity of perspectives across the medtech ecosystem and the continuum of product development as well. So one of the features of diversity inclusion that immediately comes across when one tries to build up an actionable plan to address is really the breadth of characteristics that really makes up true diversity. It can go so far beyond really just underrepresented racial and ethnic populations. So I'd like to first go kind of across the panel and ask if you could each please describe what are the elements of diversity and inclusion that are particularly relevant to your work, and perhaps any barriers that make them challenging to address specifically at the clinical trial stage. So we'll, I guess, go in the same sequence. So Nada, if you would mind addressing this question first.
Sure, thanks for the question. It's a very important question, right? And we all sit in different spheres within the medtech ecosystem. At the heart of it is the patient, because we're all patients at the end, right? Where I sit, I advise companies of all stages and sizes on developing a roadmap to get their product onto the market in a least burdensome manner. And where we find that companies are successful is when they've clearly identified a need, an unmet need, a clinical need, or a patient need, a pain point, right? And in order to develop a product that's going to meet that need, you really need to think of the end user. And think of designing a product that's going to truly allow for improved outcomes for that end user. So in terms of thinking about diversity or inclusion or representation, it needs to start very early on, upstream. The clinical study, I think, is too late. You've missed the opportunity by then, right? So kind of thinking up front, moving the thinking of how my product is really going to impact that end user and what are the unique needs of that end user, be it as a woman, as a pediatric patient, different stages of development within that pediatric patient timeline. The racial and ethnic piece is critical. Even socioeconomic status, literacy levels, where they're located in the globe, access to healthcare. There's so many different aspects that you can slice and dice it by that you need to look at. And that's where we work with companies, innovators. Sometimes it's just a physician and one who's found the pain point really try and guide them through that process. And, you know, I applaud FDA's in terms of releasing guidance documents. This is a broader one, but different centers, and since we're focused on MedTech, CDRH has had a lot of guidances in the past that focus on this area. And I think with the lens of, we know there are sex differences, so there's been more so within the differences that between the genders and how that can impact products and how effective and safe they are. But the racial ethnic piece is extremely critical, as well as age. So that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Netta. Neely, what's your perspective on this topic coming from the patient's perspective?
Well, Ned, I was really so caught up in your response, and I really agree with all that you have stated, that as not having had your experience of making those recommendations to companies, but I often have the opportunity to talk with researchers. And you and I start at the very crucial point. I encourage researchers to think about including individuals who are impacted by their end users, as you would say, at the earliest stage of their conception. That's even when you think you have an idea, talk to a patient. You know, typically what we all do, whether we are soccer moms or grandmothers or whatever the thing may be, if we get an idea, we're going to run it by a friend. I say to researchers, run it by a patient. Take it by a patient and get some feedback from them before you even completely conceptualize or finalize what you think you want to go and research. That is beginning with the patient in the beginning, allowing them to give you some input. There are 3 primary C's I like to talk with our researchers in our community. In our community, I talk about it at the same time. Those 3 C's are culture, community, and context. If you address those particular elements of the product you're trying to buy, produce, or the lives of those folks that you are impacting, if you address those areas in their world, you'll have a roadmap. You'll have a doorway in which to enter into and bring forth that product that you need. And instead of you having to fight to get the end user to see it's important, the end users will have bought in on the beginning. And then you will have something that's useful and not just meaningful to you as a product, as a business, but it's meaningful to the people who will receive it, because it is their lives that particular apparatus is going to either enhance or decrease. And it cannot be known until we have those engagement points and understanding both the culture of the folks that you are reaching out to, or you are using it. I had the experience of going into Belize to deliver a talk, a workshop for, I believe, HIV/AIDS. I was all prepared, set up in their auditorium. We were ready to go. When the recipients got to the conference, they had rode a rickety bus 90 miles to get to this conference in Belize City. They wanted to talk about domestic violence. They needed information about domestic violence. They were not ready to use information about HIV/AIDS. And so it changed the whole dynamic, because we really started at the wrong place. They gave them what they thought they needed. When they got there, they told us what they needed. And I think we can all learn a lesson from that, making sure your audience, for whatever product you're bringing, is ready to receive what you have to give in a very equitable, inclusive manner.
Mm-hmm. No, that's such an important reminder, Neely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Jamie, in your work, what would be those elements of kind of diversity or readiness of those elements of the patient and the end user population that you find are particularly challenging to address?
Sure. So for me, in terms of the trial itself, there's sort of 3 areas. It's access, inclusion, and then need. And the barriers that really impact us, something that Netta just said, it's not all about the clinical trial. Access starts with everybody, and it's a conversation that everyone needs to have frequently and routinely, whether it's with the patient advocacy groups, regulators, payers. the physicians, the nurses, the healthcare staff actually at the hospital infrastructure, everyone actually has to be aware of those barriers to entry. And I'll give you a real-time example. As I was working with some physicians to try to get more women included in a research study, and I was actually asking questions as to why we had fewer women, one of the answers that I actually received from our researchers, our physicians, was a woman takes more time to consent for a research study. She will ask far more questions than a man will. So given that the physicians are so pressed for time, that particular group wasn't offering the studies to women because they didn't have time to answer the questions. And it was a huge sort of eye-opening moment for us, right, on the industry side, to say, okay, this takes a consolidated team effort to figure out how do we help everybody carve out more time and make this more tangible. If we can do that, then you actually get to inclusion. And the barriers that we have for inclusion historically have been the clinical trials have always had to have these in-office, face-to-face visits. And that prevents so many people who have a daytime job that can't take off time from work to come in and participate. So now through the elements of telehealth visits, which we've seen almost as the silver lining of COVID, we've actually seen some of the demographic shift in the trials. And this is something that I'm hoping we talk about and we can preserve. And then that last piece that we see is this need. And what we're not seeing change with the population and the demographics changes in the US, we're not seeing enough researchers, medical doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals that actually represent their demographic. So we need people to actually get out into junior high schools and colleges and recruit these individuals to go and become doctors and nurses so they can actually bring their experiences and represent the patients that look like them in the product development lifecycle process and the clinical trial process.
Amazing. Thank you, Jamie. There are a couple of items you brought up that I'd like to circle back to, but first I want to give Kathleen an opportunity because her function sits a little bit outside of the clinical trial directly, and I think has an interesting perspective to meet some of these pieces of diversity that can be challenging to meet in the trials themselves. So Kathleen, what would be your piece that you're able to address or that you find challenging to address from your view?
So we've heard, we were on essential elements, and with regard to where I think real world evidence is able to do something a little bit different, is that it can really provide a more complete picture of who's receiving actual care and those outcomes. It also helps to inform sort of barriers and what I would call missingness and help us define the essential elements that we've heard from other members of the panel. So outside of social determinants of health, right? Like what are those and how do we figure out those constructs? I see that as both an opportunity to identify these essential elements and a barrier. Similarly, while many items are available for race, ethnicity, and gender, those are essential. There's a lack of both consensus and standardization across all of our research and all of our efforts right now. And so before we get to the pieces I think that are missing, it will be helpful for us as a team, as an industry, as researchers and people bringing products to people to think about whether or not we need 3 or 4 racial categories or 30 or 40. And then once that is standardized, to be able to classify individuals into the category that represents them. Sort of last on these, I would think that things that are essential that are often misrepresented or just missing are things like housing status, mix of insurance coverage, if you're covered now but you weren't covered 3 years ago, and how that impacts your ability to really either participate in a clinical trial or your wellness, whether or not you participate and are found in real world evidence, and the presence of absence of a primary care provider and things like housing status. So that's things I think that as we both think about improving representation in clinical trials and gathering and having representative access outside of a randomized clinical trial, the information that's going to be helpful as we move forward.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think the element there around kind of changes through a patient's lifetime as they progress through that patient journey is so critical to understand, and that it can parallel, but it can also be very different than either the product development lifecycle or even the treatment pathway that a patient progresses along. So Nada, you've obviously described how thinking about diversity at the clinical trial stage is already late if it's going to be meaningfully addressed. Can you share more about kind of your perspective on where in the product development pathway this can be engaged and how this can be achieved? I know that kind of some technical measures of how people can really meaningfully bring up this topic earlier on is often what people are missing or curious about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's the total product life cycle, right? It starts from ideation. I have an idea. And I think Neely hit the nail on the head there. It's, you have an idea, you got to bring in that patient perspective from that idea stage. You're then doing your prototyping, then you're developing your MVP, you know, and then you're going to have to go through testing, preclinical testing, animal testing, potentially clinical testing. Then there's the regulatory piece, and then it's getting onto market and it's post-market surveillance. What's that information in the post-market arena? How's that feeding into either changing or updating your product, and making sure it stays safe and effective once it's on the market. And then, you know, it's a cycle. It's a total product life cycle. I think at each touch point within that total product life cycle, you need to be looking at it from the lens, through the eyes of who's the end user and what are their unique needs. You need to be developing products from prototyping, from the ideation with those unique end users' needs in mind. And I think it's hard, and Jamie I'd love Jamie to jump in on this because her and I have talked a lot about this. A lot of times, you know, as a design engineer, you think of like, so what's the anatomical difference? Yeah, that's a great one to ask about, but there's so many other aspects, and everyone kind of touched on it here, right? Anatomical, straight away, you notice the difference, you know, it's an easy understanding. Women, men, we're different. But a lot of times devices are designed as though a woman is a little man, but she's not. And also women go beyond bikini medicine. I'm sure we've all heard that. It's not just the boobs and the breasts, and it's not just the vagina and the uterus. We use other devices. Women have to get hip implants, knee implants. They have to get ocular implants, whatever. So, and there are unique differences. So you got to think about the holistic picture. And I think engineers may struggle with that a little. And how can it starts with awareness of even just asking the question. But I'll stop because I saw Jamie on mute and I'd love to hear her perspective.
Well, it's really interesting. So Netta, you raised this point to me not too long ago, and you kind of challenged me as to how we're looking at it, right, as a big company. And I love what you're bringing to the table, because I did two things after you first raised this. First, I went back and I had a conversation with one of my foreign doctors, and he's actually a surgeon. So I try to use technology that doesn't require the chest wall to be sawed open, but he does this. And so I said, when you're looking inside our patients, whether they're Black, brown, whatever ethnicity, what do you see anatomically? Because we have anatomical models on the bench that are built to sort of simulate all of us. And he said, great question, right? So generally speaking, he said the heart is not that different. Obviously, women are a little bit smaller, or Asian patients could be a little bit smaller, but anatomically it's the same. But it's feeders, things like some of the extra vasculature that can be a little bit different. Some can be a little bit tighter, a little bit more coiled. And he said the main difference that I see, less anatomically, but more dietary related, that we don't think about and we don't talk about, is how like my Indian population actually has perhaps a little bit higher fat diet, and what that's doing to the delivery pathways to actually get to the heart. And so we had a fantastic conversation. And so I think you raised a really valid point, Netta, which is sometimes at the engineering level, we're only focused on the device itself and not the ancillary products and pathways to get to like something that we're trying to treat. So it's important to feed that in. And as part of this ongoing stuff that I've been working with you on, we've now started to infuse the question early on, which is to say, we need to be asking diversity and inclusion questions at every stage. And it may be that there's nothing to tick the box on today, but at least we've asked the question early on. And even Neely's raising a great point. What's the patient perspective? We need to be asking those at every step in the product life cycle.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. No, I love those contributions, Jamie, and especially thinking through from that surgeon's input, what are kind of the cultural and behavioral aspects of a patient's life that are going to impact in a very tangible way the physiology and the way a device interacts, which, you know, at first glance may feel like something that's really worlds apart, but at the end of the day are going to have to sit side by side. And so I think that's a really nice transition now to go back to Neely and ask, you know, as a patient co-investigator in studies, how does this, you know, work relate to the work you've been doing with the NIH and with PCORI. And as the conversations around decentralization and digital, do you see these tools being brought into that equation as a way to either help or hinder the ability to achieve that representation of diversity and inclusion? There we go.
Thank you. Without having those conversations that allow for the inclusion of patients' voices being heard early on, without having that, we encounter roadblocks that maybe wouldn't be there if we would just have had some dialogue about how does this fit in your world. Because I go back to my C's. If you don't consider those things in what you're developing, or what's even in the digital part, we have COVID has had some silver linings as it relates to our ability to communicate. Certainly not outweighing the difficulties it caused, but having this, being able to, we couldn't have done this way, but pre-COVID. It's not in the same degree as we are doing it now, because we've gotten used to it. And guess what? That has paid off also in our ability to communicate with patients. Now we are not limited to that 9 to 5 time slots. That's the work hours for researchers or institutions or nonprofit organizations. It is more open that you can set up a Zoom meeting with patients at 8 o'clock at night. Folks who have finished feeding their kids and gotten them in the bed or on the way to the bed, and now they can sit back and have a conversation with you about your idea and think about how does that really fit in my world every day. And so that is the way it impacts us, is to always be asking the diversity questions as it relates to, and the equity questions when we are going through the process, not waiting until we get to the end of the process and say, oh, we should have found this out. Let's go find this out now and make application of, put it in our report, make it sound like it's something we've been doing all the time, when it's really, that's not what the truth of the matter is. We have to engage our individuals who are going to be impacted by the things that we are using. And digitally, it's improved. We have a greater scope of folks we can now. Grandmother can now sit back and do a telemedicine appointment. Maybe need a little bit of help from a grandson or granddad. I need one around all the time, but to get set up. But they feel a little bit more comfortable having that talk with that doctor or that nurse just by virtual, being able to see them on the screen versus having to go into that office to see them. So that's that, along with other ways, making sure we understand the culture of the folks, understand the role that community plays and how folks address issues and how folks use products. Community has great influence. If I'm in a community of people who do not do that for whatever the reason, it's going to be difficult for you to get, if you don't understand that from the beginning and understand this can pose a barrier that I would have never thought of if I hadn't had that conversation.
That's such a good point, Neely. It really, it brings me back to some of the community initiatives that we've done using our platform to engage in communities and kind of leverage those existing networks of trust amongst patients. Absolutely. That use to share information or even accelerate recruitment and kind of spread the word within those communities that are traditionally more challenging to access. So that's a really great point. And Jamie, I know we spoke before, and kind of in addition to the product development pathway, there are other kind of contemporary issues in this kind of transition out of the COVID pandemic mode that we're in that influence evidence strategies and how digital approaches can be leveraged to address diversity inclusion. And you alluded to it a little bit in your previous response. Can you speak a little bit more about what the shift towards digital that was accelerated during COVID and how that's impacted your work?
Sure. So we had some really positive outcomes from COVID being terrible, but some very positive surprises. One of them being there's a reimbursement process that happens at hospitals. They use CPT codes. People on the call probably know what those are. And the CPT codes historically in the clinical research studies, as I mentioned, require the patients to come back in for office visits, and that it commands a higher reimbursement. During COVID, CMS was fantastic to actually issue a relief policy under the COVID-19 public health crisis. And they said, you guys can actually be reimbursed for the same amount of money by using a telehealth visit. Well, not only did this protect patient safety and unburden the hospitals, who, as we all know, were just really bogged down with the COVID patients, but it actually allowed now the participation of more minority patients because they didn't have to physically go into an institution. They could have a telehealth visit. And with the help of ethics committees and IRBs also throughout the US, but quite frankly, globally, there was more uptake and allowance for electronic informed consent forms. We've all been trying to use them for years, but we've had a lot of challenges to implement them. And there was such a collaboration to allow those two pieces that we've seen a definite change in the number of minoritized participation. That plus there were some other things that FDA did, also being a really great partner where they were trying to protect patient safety. They said, okay, from a clinical trial perspective and design, instead of say having to have a patient come in every single year for a certain test, we don't know how long this pandemic is going to go on for, change the structure. So we'll allow you to do every other year, every 2 years, take a look at what's really critical versus what's need-based. And so FDA was fantastic to do that. And so I think that I would say people can use this even in the future to define what has to be done every year from a testing perspective or a data collection perspective versus what can be pushed off to a certain percentage of time. Or if there's a certain percentage of the data that doesn't have to be 100% perfect. We have things like treadmill stress tests. You didn't want to do those during COVID, right? Everybody's just, blowing COVID potentially around a room. So we said, hey, 30% of these studies maybe won't have the treadmill stress test, but there's still the 70% that would pre and post pandemic. So there were a lot of these really positive changes that the regulators helped us with during COVID. The key is, can we continue to infuse these and keep these post pandemic, because it does really change the D&I scorecard for who's able to participate in the trials.
No, that's such an important capability, I would say, just to keep the pieces that worked out of that kind of unplanned global experiment of how we engaged with patients across the board during the pandemic. And that piece, you've touched on a couple of things that relate to Kathleen's work, and obviously Jamie's example shows how kind of evidence generation is really going to connect to the delivery of care and the real world interaction of patients with their care teams. Can you highlight how real world evidence can impact that ability to achieve diversity and inclusion, and what some of the applications of real world evidence that may not be top of mind, especially for those folks who are really focused on clinical development? And I wonder if I can unmute you there.
Thank you. I was going to say we're on mute again. So before I launch into an answer to your question, I just want to take a moment and pause on what both Neely and Jamie, and I think Nada also raised, which was that advances and accelerations through the pandemic changed some of the ways we approach both policies and systems, and that we've kind of launched into this new space where I think the challenge is to both keep those as well as to figure out how to adapt systems and policies to admit us to continue to collect that type of information and engage with patients both either inside or outside the clinical trial environment as they access health. So, and their caregivers, right? That's kind of the other piece with both patient-reported outcomes, caregiver-reported data. I think it's just an important edge that we're hearing for those designing clinical trials or assessing populations, that those are just tools that we didn't have 2 years ago and are important to keep in front of us. When I think about the benefit of real world evidence and really what it allows for, I mentioned before, it really is a more complete picture of who's receiving actual care and the outcomes. So beyond what I would call the narrow rigor of a randomized clinical trial, expanding the aperture a little bit to include other populations and assessing in that same fit, or applying that same fit for purpose rigor, can provide evidence for relationships and populations that were underrepresented, potentially not included, unable to be studied in a clinical study or a randomized trial environment, and reveal patterns. So the benefit is that we can then begin to understand and assess those to allow for improvements in the outcomes among patients, for example, with multiple comorbidities, for whom gender at birth is not the gender that they identify with, later to understand really the relationship between those patients and the way they access healthcare. So I think that's what real world evidence allows us to do, again, is to take the underrepresented or not otherwise accessed populations, whether they are women who are not small men, children who are not small people, or people who don't participate in clinical trials, and understand the way our products, whether they are devices or pharma or a combination of both, are affecting the outcomes, and then design interventions to improve their care. Applications that might not be top of mind. Neil, are you trying to jump in?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I was going to say, because you're welcome to. Just quickly on applications that may not be top of mind, where I think there's been, again, some really interesting work that's been done here in examining the patterns of care and fashioning these improvements. We've seen examples in screening and taking claims data, which, while imperfect, to say who gets screened as much as USPSTF suggests they should, and maybe who's missing in that, and then not just to quantify it, but to work toward strategies to improve it, whether it's through communities, different ways of reaching those patients and their providers, to bring them in there. So similarly, I think there are examples in surgery. We heard from Janie and from Nada about both cardiac and joint, where depending on your gender, depending on your race, depending on your insurance type, that the interventions that are offered to you or you receive or are studied in people that look like you or your family are often gated by the information that's in the package insert. So as manufacturers, I would challenge all of us to improve the information that we're able to include in that, including things like mom-baby linkages, which will impact our understanding of maternal fetal health. And again, really, exposures, whether they're in the employer or the community space, we can study with real world evidence in a way that we are not able to study in a randomized clinical trial.
Thank you, Kathleen.
I will say, Kathleen, I'll say to this question, I just love the point that you bring up about how we have some and this is where, predetermined concepts of populations. It's just, it's nothing you can do about what jumps in your head when you hear Native American. Whatever that thing is, it's pre-coded. It's not something you said, this is what I'll think when I hear that word. It's just what it is, right? But we have to be willing to go beyond that. I often hear about in my community and in my culture, non-compliant. And I have folks that come to me and say, I don't understand. And I can almost tell that this person has been coded somewhere as non-compliant and has fit a model of a group. It's not so much about that personal individual person. And it's just something simple they don't understand that has them in the place of whether they're using the medication or not using the medication, accepting the device or not accepting the device, based on anecdotal information they've heard from their community. And if we understand that, then we have a better way of being able to debunk, get around it, pre-educate, so that ideally we think we start with an individual and move to the community. But there are times when the only options is to understand the community, to move to the individual.
Neely, I think that's a great point that you raised. And I'll add, for anybody on the phone who's doing data, I had somebody point out something really critical to me the other day, which is, hey, your data checkboxes put me in a pre-coded box. But this particular person said, I am German and Mexican. I don't know what box to tick, so I don't tick any. And so we need to be aware of the pre-coding and how are we handling that and getting the voice of the patient, because they don't know what to do. And we're trying to fit them into these little nice boxes. So you just raised a really valid point.
I think also the biases, like you said, the first thing you hear Native American, right? And all these ideas come. But when someone sees you, the first thing they see is the color of your skin.
That's right.
And then your gender, right? Your sex, really. Are you female, male? And they start from there applying their purview or their own biases. And I think we need to all be aware and catch
Aware.
ourselves, because that's what the trajectory of what healthcare you're going to get, or what opportunities in life you can access just based on your outward presentation, right? It's
That's
that
right.
bias. That's really critical.
For sure. No, I think there's some of these elements around kind of the unconscious bias and the unknown unknowns that are data strategies that are developed when we have an idea of what we're already looking for, or the features that we have in mind that we're looking to validate, as opposed to coming from like a curious approach, can benefit from some new perspectives. And I know we've talked a little bit about, ways in which we can encourage perhaps the engineers, or kind of really the beginning of that product conceptualization phase, to think more broadly about the end user. But are there any other, I would say, perhaps like methodologies or disciplines that in your experience we could collectively benefit from trying to incorporate or elevate amidst kind of a very often clinical and engineering focused lens when we look at the work that we're doing in this space? And I'll just put that out to the group, whoever.
I think Neely hits the nail on the head for me personally, which is more of the patient voice sooner. I've been involved in a couple of initiatives now with Meta as well. And when I hear patients like Neely and others speak and they say, I don't want to be known as a patient. I don't want to be known so much as a participant. I'm a real person. And when you all and physicians are talking about me, you're talking about me as if I don't exist. And so when you back that up into the product development lifecycle, it's how do you pull that voice in and that participation and that active participation in sooner, so that you have true shared decision-making for how to develop products that actually work for the end user, and it's for all end users. So it's that patient voice for me.
And Renee, I'd jump in on your methodology question to add that real-world evidence, and particularly that which is patient-reported outcomes, patient-generated data care, is an area, and this applies to digital health as well, that is evolving. And it's on all of us, I think, to really help advance and advocate for standards in that area that will then allow that information to be pulled into product development and viewed as a meaningful contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think FDA is taking the strides to say patient perspectives, patient-reported outcomes, real-world evidence can help drive the regulatory decision-making, right? And it's valuable information. How do we collect it in a manner that can be meaningful for them to evaluate and analyze and assess that the product is safe and effective? I think the value of real-world evidence, as you spoke to, Kathleen, is immense, right? Because a clinical study like that artificial environment, the ideal environment of use, and we know that's never going to be the case once you get into the real world. So I think the Jamies of the world are trying to develop studies that are meaningful, that really account for that end user and their environment of use and all these factors that we've been discussing, but then taking the lived experience from that real world data and how the device worked for that specific patient population, community, and feeding that back in to if you are going to make changes to your device, or if you are going to make changes to the labeling or who it can be used in and how it can be used, or just those aspects, it's really, really critical. And I think the regulatory bodies are trying to move to recognize that sometimes they tend to be a little bit more risk averse, but patients are maybe willing to take additional risk and want to understand, did you actually study this product in people that look like me? And if not, maybe I'm willing to be a patient, right? But how do they even know or learn about the opportunities for clinical studies and for them to contribute towards the development of this data?
Mm-hmm. No, I like that idea a lot as well, kind of the concept of making participation in trials as a care option, something that introduces kind of this breadth of opportunity to participate or even just to contribute their data for that improved understanding across the ecosystem for greater representation. And I just want to remind those in the audience that if you have any specific questions, we can accept them in the Q&A chat. But there is a question that has come in terms of trying to work in collaboration with the FDA. You know, they're obviously sharing these guidances, and there's been a call for sponsors to engage early and often with the FDA, especially if they're trying to tackle some of these new approaches. What would be some of your kind of suggestions, I guess, on how collectively as an industry or even at the individual sponsor level, we could engage with the FDA to help with the greater kind of ecosystem learning about how we can improve diversity and inclusion?
Well, we know that there's the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, and they are fantastic. And so to brainstorm ideas, to ask questions, ask for best practices, that's a great place to go. There's a whole landing page on the FDA website that you can go to. So I would say that's a first place to start. Netta, you probably have some others to feed into that, but I'd say start there.
Yeah, I think the collaborative community approach, right? So FDA said there's some public health problems that are potentially within our bailiwick or we can't solve as an agency on our own. So here, the medtech ecosystem, you guys get together, industry, and collectively as a collaborative, as a community, help address these issues. And that's part of what our collaborative community, I mean, all collaborative communities are focused on areas of interest for them. And ours is diversity and inclusion in product development and clinical study research. And it's been just overwhelming regarding how industry has come together. I mean, Jamie from Edwards with her competitor from Medtronic and J&J, but they sit at the table or in a Zoom call and they say, how can we solve this problem together? How can we develop some best practices? And she's taking it and she's implementing it within her sphere of influence. So we're actually like, we're moving the needle. We have our disease awareness group that, again, it's all these different industries and patients coming together and saying, how can we engage with the communities to understand what their unique needs are? And right now we're focusing on the heart health of minorities, women, and specifically Black and Brown, because we know it's the #1 killer, right? Heart disease. So we're engaging with the communities, collecting that information, and then now wanting to feed it back into best practices, informing policies. And we have FDA, we have CMS, and we have NIH at the table wanting to work with us collectively. So I think there's collaborative communities out there, explore them, create one yourself. If FDA buys into it, they'll join. And I also, like, you're right, FDA wants you to come. They say, come early, come often. I don't like the often, I like the early. They're also really busy. So pre-submission meetings, they've created the breakthrough program for innovative products that are really addressing critical, public health diseases, conditions that are life-threatening, and trying to work with manufacturers through the product development process. So I think there's a lot of opportunities and touch points. You just need to go in thoughtfully to engage with them. You need to have done your homework and know your space and your product.
Just to add to that, just a little bit, which is very important also, is being able to speak a language those communities can hear. And that takes some work. That takes a little bit of work on the front end to say, wait a minute. I can tell you these things, but if I'm not saying it in a way that you can understand it, then I'm losing ground here. I don't want to miss this opportunity to make sure I educate and develop an understanding. So trusted messengers, most important in going in addressing communities, and having a language that community can understand. And the language is not geared in the tactic sense of English versus Spanish, that's certainly important, but you also have to be sensitive. And sensitivity plays into the language, because you can go in and turn a whole group or a whole community off just by using a word that you had no idea it had negative connotations in that community. And the last part, this has becoming my drum song. What I hope to do is to be able, I've worked consistently from the beginning with Ricori in its development before the first conference. I happened to be there. Well, it's time now to lift this out of the box and be open so that in industry and other funders can have some understanding of what is it, what did you all do over there? How did you get it to where you are now to try, and we're not where we want to be, but trying to keep patients center of the research and having patients involved in it. Well, to do that, we're going to have a planned dissemination process, because what we're having is we got all the resources up front. We're front end heavy. We got, we develop and we plan the budget around getting the work done, get it set up, getting it ready for implementation and getting the report back. And then we have this little section here that says, we will disseminate. We will do presentations at national and local conferences, blah, 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 and we will write papers. I'm not arguing the point on writing papers anymore. That's wonderful. I understand now the role the papers play, but also we need a community to conduit, so that when we go in and collect their information, we are not leaving them high and dry. They have came to the meetings or went to the lab, did whatever they needed to do. Well, I never heard what happened to that. I don't know if they developed a device that was useful for me or other people like me, or I know nothing. We cannot afford to continue to create that barrier, because that's creating a barrier for the next research that needs to be done.
Preach on, Neely. I'm smiling. Because we have Dr. Patrick G. He's also a preacher, and he's also a patient, and he's also part of our community. And he says the exact same things. And he says, you have to move at the speed of trust, right? They have to trust you. And he's like a community ambassador. So when you go into the community, you need to understand what are the unique needs of that community and how to engage with them. So thank you. Yes.
You're welcome.
100% agree.
Well, this has been, a tremendous discussion. I think we've covered quite a range of approaches and, and perspectives that can be brought in that hopefully can add some value to the attendees, depending on which stage of the product lifecycle they're addressing, or the scope of, the size of the company, and kind of operationally what challenges they're facing. So I just want to thank all of the panelists so much for your contributions today. It's been such an incredible discussion to be a part of, and really inspiring to hear about all the activities that are already ongoing in the industry, and look forward to hearing about all of the future developments. And hopefully people are walking away from this conversation with some inspiration to move the needle within their organizations. So with that, I'll pass it back to Nicole from Medtech for any final housekeeping. And thank you all for your time in participating today.
Thank you so much, everybody. What a wonderful conversation. I'm sure this is not our last. I think we have a lot more ground to cover, but it's great to start the conversation here. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you, Renee, for moderating a wonderful conversation, and to Alira for sponsoring it. As I mentioned, everyone who registered for this conversation will receive the video link following this presentation. And you can always go to massmedic.com and find out upcoming events we have. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.